Afternoon, everybody, and welcome to this week's Keeping an Eye on the Geopolitical Ball. Well, I'm going to start this week by talking about tanks. Why? Well, because everybody else is talking about tanks. Tanks have dominated the international headlines over the last couple of weeks as the Western allies, particularly Germany, have deliberated whether or not to send tanks, particularly Leopard 2 German-made tanks, to Ukraine. Now, for old Cold Warriors like me, who cut their teeth back in the 1970s and 80s, this is rather strange because after the Cold War, we spent most of our time getting rid of our tanks. Germany went from about 3,000 tanks down to 350. The Netherlands had 700 and sold them all off to Latin American countries. And for the next few decades, military technology seemed to be much more fixated on futuristic things like cyber defense, data fusion, bioengineering, hypersonic weapons, drones, disinformation campaigns, and what have you. But Ukraine surprised us in being a very 20th century kind of war, with the focus on trenches and barbed wire and fortifications, artillery, armoured personnel carriers, and now tanks. And as the NATO Supreme Allied Commander, General Cavoli, said in a speech in Sweden just a couple of weeks back, if your enemy shows up with a tank, you have to show up with a tank. And this is the conclusion that the Ukrainians have definitely reached in asking for 300 Western tanks and 600 infantry fighting vehicles or armoured personnel carriers. Well, why the Leopard in particular? It's easy. It's a tank which is operated by 20 countries, 13 of them are NATO armies. There are about 2,000 Leopards in operation today. And therefore, if you want 300 tanks, asking each of these 13 NATO countries to give up 15 or so gets you there pretty quickly, without those countries individually having to take too big a hit in terms of their conventional fighting capability. The Leopard is also relatively easy to train people on. It was designed, after all, for German conscripts. It's easy to operate. It fires a standard 130mm artillery shell, which many countries are able to manufacture. And it also is quite economical in terms of the amount of diesel that it requires to cover territory. But Ukraine is happy to receive any kind of tank, particularly the 14 Challenger 2 tanks that the UK has now offered, or the 31 M1 Abrams tanks from the United States. Maybe France will pitch in with some of its own Leclerc tanks in the very near future. Now, a lot of the debate is focused on Germany, which is key for a number of reasons. It has 330 of the tanks. Its companies manufacture and repair and maintain the tank. And so reopening those production lines will be key to sustaining Ukraine in this military effort. And it gives the licenses to countries which operate the Leopard so that legally they are able to re-export those tanks to Kiev. And therefore, there was a lot of pressure on Chancellor Olaf Scholz of Germany in recent days to agree to send the Leopard tanks, which he has now done. But what is significant about this? Well, first of all, it's going to require a consortium of about 15 NATO countries, which met a couple of days ago in Estonia, to bind together to supply the fuel, the training and the spare parts, the maintenance, to keep those Ukrainian tanks as long as they can in the field. But the second thing is that tanks are not in themselves a panacea. A tank by itself doesn't win a war. No single weapon, to my mind, as a military historian, has never won a war. It takes a combination of weapons integrated into a clever strategy to win a war. And that's why the meeting of 50 countries at Ramstein a few days ago, which looked at Ukraine's defense needs, was so important, because that meeting pledged not only certain tanks from certain countries, but also infantry fighting vehicles, Bradleys, Humvees, for example, from the United States, anti-tank weapons, new forms of artillery systems, and so on and so forth. So what is happening here is that slowly Ukraine is being developed by the West into an entirely new and major army. converted from old Soviet standards and equipment to NATO standards. Now, the West, of course, hopes that this new Ukrainian army, which I call the Army of the East, once those pieces of equipment arrive, is going to turn the tide of the war, because nobody in the West has an interest in a prolonged war, which inflicts more suffering on Ukraine, more destruction, a higher recovery cost at the end, and of course, all of the dislocation of global energy and food supply chains. But it's also the beginning of a realization in NATO that henceforth NATO is going to have to fund in the future and maintain two massive armies: an army of the East, the one that Ukraine will need to hold the Russians back over the long term, and an army of the West, the type of new army that NATO itself needs to be able to field if it's able to maintain effective defense and deterrence, given that it now has borders with Russia which are 4 times those that it had after the end of the Cold War. Because, as the chairman of the NATO Military Committee, Admiral Rob Bauer, pointed out last week, under any scenario, victory or defeat in Ukraine, Russia is going to remain resentful and revisionist. Sooner or later, it will reconstitute its own army and put pressure on Ukraine and the NATO countries again. So what are the big challenges here? Well, first of all, to ensure that the Ukrainians are victorious, because if their army emerges victorious with high morale, for example, with a high degree of cohesion, it's going to be much easier to maintain an effective Ukrainian deterrent than if it comes out of the war with a defeated, demoralized army, which is going to have to be rebuilt from scratch. Second big challenge of the Army of the East is how much of the equipment, the $40 billion worth of equipment that the West has transferred to Ukraine so far, stays in Ukraine. Do we ask for it back? For example, HIMARS or drones or artillery or Patriot air defense systems, because these are expensive and valuable and rare, and we need them for NATO rather than leaving them with Ukraine. Do we ask Ukraine to pay for all of this stuff as we go forward? The history of warfare is that countries rarely manage to recoup the kit. Look at Afghanistan, that they end up using in foreign lands. But of course, Ukraine will be awash with weapons after the war. And if it doesn't institute very effective export controls, and if it doesn't track very accurately where all of this military equipment has gone, this could be a windfall for all kinds of criminal organizations and black market dealings, which is definitely not in our interest. There's also going to be the question, as NATO ramps up production, of how much of the new production does it give to Ukraine to maintain the Army of the East, while obviously supplying its own needs in terms of the Army of the West. And finally, if we're going to have two massive armies supported by NATO in the future, what is going to be the overlap between the two in terms of exercises, air defense, early warning, interoperability, and all of these kind of things? Now, for somebody like me who lived with euphoria at the end of the Cold War when peace broke out and Der Spiegel, the German news magazine, proclaimed that there was no need any longer for any armies, suddenly having to maintain two large armies for the foreseeable future is a little bit of a shock. It reminds me a little bit of the Roman Empire in its closing centuries, which had an army of the north to push back the German tribes and an army of the south to keep peace in North Africa and the Holy Land. It's strange when just a few years ago I was at ceremonies seeing off the last American tanks going home via Wilhelmshaven and the last Canadian F-18 jets going home from the Lahr Air Force Base. Now all of this stuff is coming back and double. No, not surprising, therefore, that the Secretary General of NATO, Jens Stoltenberg, is calling for some significant defence budget increases. And definitely the topic for NATO's next summit in Vilnius this coming July is how is NATO, in the long term, going to sustain two big armies of hundreds of thousands of men each, an army of the East and an army of the West. But that is the reality that we have to deal with. Thank you for watching and listening today. Look forward to engaging with you very soon.